Ever since it premiered on Channel 4 in the UK on December 4th, 2011, Black Mirror has been sharing stories about the negative consequences of regressive technologies and containing dark themes and endings that have made people think about their own lives and how they view and use technology. I decided to watch every single episode of Black Mirror and determine what I thought about the series as a whole, and eventually rank all the episodes from worst to best. Now, a couple things before we start. One, I did not rank the episodes until after I have seen all of them, so a couple of times when talking about a specific episode, I might say that it is my best or most favorite episode, even if it isn't true. So I apologize ahead of time for the confusion. Also, I have done my best to avoid spoiling any specific plot points from any of the episodes, but if I do spoil any of the episodes, and if you are a viewer that is eager to see the series but haven't seen it yet, then I sincerely apologize. So, without further ado, let's get into analyzing and reviewing Charlie Brooker's hit series on Netflix, Black Mirror. It's a well written and well acted episode that has a good message about not being obsessed with the media and just exactly what it means to be truly private these days. However, the message isn't very clearly explained, mostly due to the overwhelming focus on a very disturbing and gross ending. I won't spoil what happens, but all I'm going to say is that I won't be eating bacon for a while. Before starring in films like Get Out and Black Panther, Daniel Kaluuya stars in this episode about a man named Bing who is living in a world where technology and advertising is forcibly placed in everyone's lives and there is nothing that they can do about it. This is a dark episode that really makes you think about the negative effects of advertising and entertainment. This episode focuses on a world where people can store and access literally any moment in their life at any time. You can access any memory and be able to remember or relive any events that you may possibly forget. Sounds cool, right? Well, maybe not. Being able to never forget anything and access any memory in your life might have negative consequences, like with the main character Liam, played by Toby Kebbell. Once Liam learns of his wife's affair, it leads him towards an emotionally downward spiral involving alcoholism and betrayal. It is a dark episode with interesting social commentary. Be Right Back is an episode that I feel somewhat conflicted about. I have an overall positive reaction to this one, but there are quite a few flaws. There were a few moments where characters made decisions that I feel people in real life wouldn't make. I know that the show isn't supposed to be completely realistic. No show is. But some moments still felt a little too far-fetched for me to ingest. However, it is still an emotional episode about properly moving on when a loved one passes away. This post-apocalyptic episode about most of the people in the world being mysteriously forced to be on their phones 24/7, and then some of the unaffected mysteriously committing cruel and sadistic acts is really freaky. I'm not sure if there is an exact message or moral the audience is supposed to learn from this episode, but it was entertaining and had legitimately tense moments and great acting. This episode about a comedian who reluctantly voices a popular cartoon character called Waldo the Bear and then is forcibly involved in politics is surprisingly boring. I almost fell asleep a couple times while watching the episode. In addition, there are quite a few moments where a character did or said something that was just plain awful that I felt was both unrealistic and unlikable. And without spoiling anything, the ending is a little too depressing. This is probably my least favorite episode. Probably. This approximately 90-minute Christmas special is one that will remain in your thoughts days after watching it. This episode focuses on two very different men, played by John Hamm and Rafe Spall, who have some very dark and tragic pasts and secrets and reveal them to each other after being stuck in the same cabin together for 5 years. I won't say anything else about the plot other than that. All I will say is that this episode is very disturbing. So, be emotionally prepared and sound before watching. This episode might be a little too realistic, and that should scare all of us. Nosedive focuses on a woman named Lacey, played by Bryce Dallas Howard, who lives in a world where you are only worth something if you have a high rating on a very open social media app. It is a world where nothing is private anymore, and brutal, honest remarks will actually lower a person's score and popularity. This episode made me sad because the world presented in Nosedive isn't too far from reality. People today are obsessed with appearing perfect and use social media to make themselves look more appealing, and where no one can truly be honest anymore, or themselves anymore, or else they are seen as crazy. I appreciate the message that this episode is trying to teach, but unfortunately, this episode does have quite a few flaws. The pacing is odd. The episode also has quite a few jokes that don't work and clash with the serious tone of the story. Still, I think that this episode is worth watching just for the hard-hitting message. This episode about a man named Cooper who runs away from home and travels around the world, but then ends up having to participate in a playtest of an augmented reality horror video game in England when he runs low on funds, is surprising and shocking. I really did not know where the story was going, and where it led left me both shocked and intrigued. A few issues that I have with this episode are that the beginning is kind of slow, the dialogue's a bit iffy at times, and I don't like that the main character's name is Cooper. Besides that, this is a surprisingly intense but always entertaining episode. This is one of the most intense episodes of the entire series. After hackers gain access to a young man watching pornography through the camera lens on his laptop, the young man, named Kenny, must do everything that the hackers tell him to do. From there, every single event that Kenny has to go through is intense and unpredictable. This episode challenges our views on whether people who have done terrible things should be forgiven or not, and whether they are truly bad people or just good people who have done one bad thing. This is a dark and intense episode that really makes you think. Wow, just wow. This powerful, well acted, excellently written, and wonderfully directed episode might just be one of my favorites so far. Starring Gugu Mbatha-Raw and Mackenzie Davis, this story about two emotionally lost women who form a relationship that seems to defy the laws of space and time is a beautiful one. I don't want to say any more because I want all of you to watch this episode knowing as little as possible for the first time, which is exactly how I saw it. I watched San Junipero knowing very little, and it is now one of my favorite episodes in the series, possibly my favorite. This episode is somewhat conflicting to me. While the story is interesting and the acting is good, the episode feels somewhat unfocused in terms of how it is directed. There are quite a few slow moments that I personally did not think needed to be slow. There are also is a great use of point of view shots that I did not think was necessary, and some of the dialogue wasn't that good. Overall, this episode isn't bad. It is a highly interesting episode about how far the government and the military will go to protect the so-called good guys. However, the flaws prevent me from calling this episode a great one. Just like Shut Up and Dance, this is another episode that challenges the audience's views on whether people who have done terrible things should be forgiven or not, and whether they are truly bad people or just good people who have done one terrible thing. Except this episode goes the extra mile and also judges the people who judge others based on their actions rather than their personalities. Centered on a sarcastic, snarky detective named Karen Park who looks into an online game where people tweet #death2 and that person will get killed, this episode is an excellently written and acted episode that feels sort of like a neo-noir mystery thriller movie. It is about the same length as a movie too, 90 minutes. This is another great episode of Black Mirror that really makes the viewers at home think. This Star Trek inspired episode about a woman who is on board a ship called the USS Callister, helmed by the cruel and self centered Captain Robert Daly, is one that I wasn't expecting to like so much. I am not really that big of a fan of the original Star Trek series, but watching this episode actually made me want to watch some episodes of the original Star Trek series. Everyone on the cast and crew does a great job, but I really have to commend Jesse Plemons and Kristen Milotti for their layered and excellent performances. Even if you don't like Star Trek, you will like this episode.
Sarah is 3 and she's. Sarah! Sarah! Sarah!
I cannot state this as a fact because I am not a parent, but I believe that this extremely protective parenting can be harmful to a child in a psychologically and emotionally way. This episode is about a young girl named Sarah who has a device implanted into her brain that prevents her from hearing and seeing disturbing words or imagery, depending on what her mother defines as disturbing words or imagery, and her loving and overprotective mother can see whatever she sees. I understand most of what the mother does, but there is this one thing that she does to her daughter that I thought was completely out of line. This is a good episode that has an interesting concept and great acting, but is unfortunately bogged down by the slow pacing and that one specific incident involving the mother slipping a pregnancy pill into her daughter's drink. Overall, it is a good episode, but not one of my favorites. I know that Black Mirror is a show where people act on their deepest, darkest desires or do terrible things out of desperation. However, I feel like in this specific episode, it would have been easier for the main character, Mia, to do the right thing. But there has to be a conflict or else there will be no episode, so of course, she always does the wrong thing, even if it would be easier to do the right thing, and ends up hiding her involvement in a car accident that fatally wounded a man and attempts to hide her former boyfriend who she killed due to his guilt and attempts to reveal himself as one of the involved in the incident. The story starts off with this accident and this desperate but cruel murder that Mia commits against her former boyfriend, and I feel like she didn't have to do that. There is also kind of a subplot involving a female detective named Shaza that I thought put the story to a halt, even though it is necessary at the end. Because of these two factors, I don't like this episode. This episode is centered on a man and a woman named Frank and Amy who clearly have feelings for each other but choose not to date because of their over reliance on a system that matches them with various individuals until they find who truly could be the one. What is so interesting about this episode is that through this story, the filmmakers challenge our perceptions of relationships and romantic bonding and the validity of social dating apps. Overall, it is a great episode. I personally thought that this episode was cool, but it didn't feel complete. I felt as if this episode was just a short segment of a post apocalyptic movie that would have been a lot better. I felt as we, the audience, weren't given enough time and exposition to truly care about the characters, nor understand how the world works or how dire the situation is. I also didn't like that the main antagonists in this episode were basically just a bunch of small mechanical dogs. They are deadly for sure, but I feel like it would be much easier to destroy them in real life. This episode would have been much better if it was a full length movie or something, and if we were given more information about the world that these characters have to live in. A traveling woman named Nish stops by a museum titled Black Museum and goes inside where she meets a man named Rollo Haynes who owns the museum and has various artifacts that are somewhat connected to a crime, including a main disturbing attraction. The story consists of Rollo telling several stories about the artifacts to Nish, and as the episode goes on, it physically gets hotter due to the AC inside the museum being broken. This episode was a little tough for me to follow at first, but then I was able to catch up on the story and it became quite intriguing. The episode stars Letita Wright, who you may know as Shuri from Black Panther, T'Challa's younger sister. This episode is a unique and enjoyable conclusion to the fourth season of Black Mirror, but not for anyone who is lighthearted or can't handle graphic, violent content.